Thank you so much for joining us. My name's June Stevenson and I'm Head of School Surveys here at Teacher Tapp. We're particularly grateful to have Professor Becky Allen and Head Teacher Simon Ellis joining us to speak today. So thank you very much to you two. We're recording for those who aren't able to join us in person. We've got a 45-minute session, and so there should be time to hear from both Becky and Simon, and hopefully have a bit of time for some questions as well. I'm just going to share my screen. And then we can hopefully get started. Okay, so retention reality. This is what we've been talking about recently at School Surveys. I'll just say a few words of introduction before we get going. So yes, I'm June Stevenson, Head of School Surveys, and we're going to hear from Becky is going to talk about some national insights about this topic of retention. And then we've asked Simon Ellis, Head Teacher, to share some of his insights from his school in Wrexham in Wales. So to explain a little bit about where we get these insights from, so Teacher Tapp is a free app that individual teachers download onto their phone, and they answer 3 questions every day. They then see the results the next day of what everyone has said in answer to those questions. We at Teacher Tapp share what we find. So we're all about making teacher voices heard across the sector. School Surveys is our surveying platform for school leaders to use in their own schools, and they can survey their staff, their parents and their pupils. So we have a bank of expertly written questions taken from the Teacher Tapp bank. The surveys are very quick and easy to set up. And so then school leaders can send them out to their staff, their pupils or their parents and get benchmarked reports back. So that's who we are. From all of that, you can imagine we have a lot of data and insights, and that's where Becky comes in, because I've asked if Becky could, first of all, she is our chief analyst and co-founder of Teacher Tapp. I've asked Becky if she could share with us, to start with, some of the insights that we have gleaned about this important topic of retention in schools. So over to you, Becky.
Great, thank you very much. We've been thinking about why do teachers choose to leave their jobs in schools now since 2017. And indeed, this big question was the #1 reason why we wanted to start Teacher Tapp, to really understand what was going wrong in schools that was causing teachers to feel like they didn't want to stay in their jobs. So the data I'm going to be talking about today is all Teacher Tapp data. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about some research projects that we're currently running, that if you have been on the app recently in the last year, you might have seen some very weird kind of questions on the app that are quite experimental. Maybe I'll say a few things about them today. But to start with some of the headlines, because they don't look good. First of all, we regularly ask this question at the end of every term. We say, have you considered resigning from your job this term? And June, if you can put it up.
Yes.
And the number of people who say either sometimes, often or constantly thinking about resigning is 48%, which is a massive number. And we'll talk a little bit about what they're encountering that's causing that to happen. But then every year on Boxing Day, we ask, how likely are you to leave your post this year? And this year, when we asked, 16% of teachers said that they thought that they were likely to be leaving their teaching job at their school this year. We asked them, those who said that, why, and we gave them an open-ended text response where they could say anything that they wanted. And I'm going to talk about like some of the negative things that go wrong that they dislike in a moment on some other slides, but I'll just mention like 2 things that showed up that were kind of surprising and worth some thought for me. But the first was, for the first time ever, I saw a material number of teachers saying, I will be leaving my school in the summer because my school is closing. And this is a reminder that like the demographic collapse is really starting to hit primary schools, and we've never seen this before. Large numbers of primary schools across the country closing, and thus primary teachers will be losing their jobs. So that was something of a surprise. But the other thing was the thing that was the kind of not negative thing, which was that of those who said I'm likely to be leaving, about 13%, so 13%, said something that was kind of not that they were overwhelmed, but quite the opposite, that they wanted a new challenge, that they felt that they wanted to move for their career development, they wanted to experience something new, and try and do a different kind of job. And to me, that's a really interesting group of teachers, because it's a group of teachers that I think that if you knew that as a head, you knew that a teacher felt like that, maybe might be something that you could do for them within the school to give them the kind of professional challenge and development that they need. We also regularly ask about something we call burnout. On those kind of burnout questions, we regularly get about 1 in 10 of the profession experiencing very high levels of burnout, saying they're completely overwhelmed in their jobs and they wonder whether they can carry on. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. The retention problem appears to have gotten worse. This data shows the data from before the pandemic in 2019, but even if I went all the way back to 2017, it would still look much the same, that we seem to have seen a step kind of deterioration in the proportion of teachers who say that they think that they're going to be in the profession in 3 years' time. Now, you have to remember, whenever we ask this question, it doesn't mean that they will all manage to leave, but at least this is their expectations when we ask them. And I think having a profession where quite a large proportion of teachers are now saying they don't plan to be around in 3 years isn't particularly healthy, because it means they're not particularly kind of attached to their jobs and invested in their jobs. Now, when we first started seeing this deterioration, it was happening in the aftermath of the particularly difficult period in the pandemic, where we had online learning taking place in early 2021 and so on. We assumed that this was kind of a pandemic shock, and we hoped that things would go back to normal, but they haven't. And I'm going to spend some time on the other slides, like talking about two of the big things that I think are the problems that are going on for the profession. But we're currently now at the point where 59% of teachers say, yes, I think I plan to be in the profession in 3 years' time. That's a pretty low figure. We're currently doing some research on Teacher Tapp that's been throwing up some interesting things about the teacher labour market. I don't know whether any of you have seen a question recently where you were asked to name another local school that was close to your existing school. And after you named it, you were then told, well, suppose this exactly the same job that you're doing at the moment comes up at this other local school. What kind of salary change would it take for you to consider applying for that job there? We have been asking these questions because we're actually interested in the effects of social deprivation on teachers' willingness to work at schools. But it threw up something else that was really interesting to me, which was just, on average, in order to do exactly the same job at exactly the same kind of school with the same demographic locally, all teachers would require a pay rise to go and do it. And if you think well, why would they require that? Because it's just the same kind of job. Well, the answer is firstly, it's really costly to move schools. The personal investment you have to make in learning a new curriculum, to getting together with your new resources to teach the curriculum is really, really high. You arrive at a school on day one and the kids don't know you and the staff don't know you, and it's really tough to build a new reputation and manage behaviour when you're trying to build a reputation. There's also just your loss of your friends that you have at your existing school, and also the huge risk that you go to another school and there's something going on there that means it's actually a tough school to work in or an unpleasant job in some way, the kind of jeopardy associated with moving schools. Why do I think that's important? Well, I think often when we worry about high turnover, it's easy for like heads to worry a lot about like the recruitment costs of hiring new teachers in terms of like the direct costs of adverts and the costs of putting together a panel and running interview days and so on. But it's a reminder that there's another cost as well, which is that every time you offer a job to a teacher who's coming to your school, for them to make a move, assuming they already have a job, there's always a risk involved. In the sense, you kind of have to pay the price of that risk in the salary if you're asking people to do sideways moves, which is why it's always best to hang on to your existing teachers if you like them and if you want to keep them, because you don't have to pay that price. Okay, moving on to what people say on Teacher Tapp are the things that are causing stress in the profession. Well, now when we look at this question, the number one thing they pick is student behaviour. And this is true in primary schools as much as it is in secondary schools, where behaviour can be equally disruptive. But they also pick some other things. You know, administrative tasks are not that far behind as things that they make them feel very stressed and unhappy. And we may not think that this is like should be a big part of a teacher's job. We think of the classroom time as being the big burdensome time and the planning and marking associated with it, but it's part of the job that they really dislike and makes them feel unhappy. And there have been some changes over time in the responses that people have given to this question. So for example, if you move on,
Yep.
Okay, so for example, there's been a big rise in the number of teachers saying that student behaviour is a particular thing that's making them feel stressed and unhappy in schools. I think everybody agrees that student behaviour nationally has become a major issue and has got worse. But there's been a fall off in some other things that are mentioned, and most notably, I think the fall off in the extent to which the accountability system is mentioned as something that's causing people who work in schools to feel particularly stressed or unhappy. We've clearly been through quite a strange time with the accountability system, you know, the complete loss of performance tables as a result of the pandemic, followed by their kind of strange appearance again, but actually, you know, the extent to which we're going to be able to measure school performance in a good way through progress measures is going to be heavily limited by having missing baseline data in both sectors for periods of time. And then also, you know, everything that's gone on at Ofsted has led to some quite, you know, radical kind of changes in the way that not just the inspectorate have been perceived, but also the way that schools have been held accountable. And of course, there's been new news on that today. And so, you know, for me, like one of the big changes and one of the big things that I think is responsible for the deterioration in the number of teachers who say they want to stay in the profession, they plan to stay in the profession. One of them, I think, is student behaviour, because it just impacts them and is so tiring moment to moment. But the last thing I want to talk about is the other thing that I think is a problem, and it's quite hard for us to do something about, and that is flexible working. So, we've asked regularly about flexible working since the pandemic in particular, where this started becoming an issue. And we had this statement that we introduced during the pandemic saying the increase in work from home contracts in other professions has made it more likely that I will leave teaching in the next few years. It's now the case that 42% of teachers agree with that statement. And it actually wasn't true immediately after the pandemic. It feels like something where it's taken some time for teachers to really get their head around the fact that so many of their, you know, peers and their friends around them from university who took similar degrees to them and so on are now sitting at home and working from home. You might think that this is something that only people with children at home want to be doing, but at least as far as we can see in our Teacher Tapp data, that's just not true. That working from home is something that's having an impact on how teachers perceive the desirability of teaching, like across the board, across from the very youngest to the very oldest teachers. And I think the current agenda that's very complex for schools to deal with is the agenda around PPA time and how it's being taken and where it's being taken. So at the moment, 60% of teachers say they would like to see a PPA at home policy in their school. And we ask that as a kind of closed response question, would you like it or not? We also just ask this open question, which is, if your school could do anything to improve like the flexibility of working practice at your school, what would you want? And in that type of open response, like which I think we only asked a couple of days ago on Teacher Tapp, like the overwhelming majority of teachers are typing their PPA at home. They want to have PPA at home. And yet, at the moment, just 28% of teachers say to us that they're allowed to do their PPA at home if they wish. Now, you know, we know from heads there's all kinds of issues with this, because we ask heads, what are the problems? And I think the problems that heads are experiencing around perceptions, I think, of equity, that they know that if it's almost impossible within their school to allow everybody to have PPA at home, they therefore don't want to set up a system that allows some people to have PPA at home and others not to have PPA at home. Other heads are worrying about consistency for their kids in the school if teachers are coming on and off site. And then somewhat ironically, given that we think that PPA at home could help with teacher shortages, heads say, well, I've got a teacher shortage, so I can't be flexible in the way that I'm giving out PPA or give people greater time for it, because actually I can't recruit to cover these kind of flexible working practices. We've got another project that's been going where we've been asking teachers about not just like what do you want, but like how much do you value things in salary terms. And so we've been asking them some very strange questions about different kind of bundles of like a job contract. And we're trying to work out like how much would you actually be prepared to knock off your salary for some of these kind of perks of working practices, what you really value. And so far, this project, it hasn't reported yet, but we can see there's some things they just don't value at all in salary terms. Things like on-site childcare arrangements, things like ad hoc flexibility to come and go for special events, special family events, and so on. These are not things that they value so much. They've been willing to accept a lower salary for them. The things that they really do value a lot are just overall increases in PPA time. So if they were able to do a contract where they had 20% PPA as a classroom teacher rather than 10%, they really value that a lot. They value quite radical policies to try and introduce 35-hour working weeks, as Scotland has done somewhat successfully. So it'd be interesting to think about how could you pull that off within your school so that everybody only worked 35 hours a week. They also do value, surprisingly, they'd be willing to give up salary. They value it so much, smaller class sizes. We might want to think maybe about the interplay between like disruption and behaviour and the smaller class sizes. So we're continuing to do more research on retention as a whole and all these different elements of it, and happy to hear if people have got any questions or things they would like to see asked on Teacher Tapp in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That's fantastic. Really interesting insights for us there. I think what we'll do is maybe we'll take questions at the end. So if you've got a good question for Becky, please hold on to it, jot it down, or you could put it into the chat if you like. And I'd like to now introduce Simon. We're very grateful that Simon's agreed to share with us today. He's a head teacher who's been using our school surveys platform. And we're delighted, Simon, that you're going to bring a little bit of your experience of actually dealing with this very issue in your school. And we'd love to hear what you think about this.
Thanks, June. Just to introduce myself, I'm Simon Ellis. I've been a head teacher for 14 years, and I'm sitting interestingly listening to Becky about what is motivating people, because it occurred to me that having been in my last headship for 13 years, I just felt the need to move. And there certainly is a post-pandemic thing going on about staff wanting to create value in their work, and certainly my move was motivated by value. Let's see if I can share my screen. I think would probably be the best way to do that. Okay. I can't see you, but can somebody tell me if you can see that screen?
Yeah, that's
can,
great.
Yes.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay. So I've called this Improving and Improving. I just want to describe our school and what we're doing and why we're doing that. So here's our school, Ysgol Clywedog. It's situated in the city of Wrexham in North Wales. And it has had many problems. I've taken over as the head teacher of it this September, having been the head teacher of a nearby school for, like I said, 13 odd years. So the context of the school is we've been in special measures. Now we're Estin, not Ofsted. There are differences, but probably not enough to go into at the moment, but you get the idea. Special measures for 4 years, and there's been 4 head teachers in those 4 years. So a lot of flux within the school, very poor examination results, very high staff absence, and a leadership approach from the last 2 head teachers that had been very top down and prescriptive. And from what Becky's saying, I've got a theory into some of the motivation of teachers and some ways in which schools like our own try to improve. Sometimes they see it as a very prescriptive way of teaching. You create an average level of teaching by making everybody do this for 10 minutes, this next thing for another 10 minutes, and you actually prescribe exactly what goes on in the lessons. And for me, you devalue the nature of a teacher and you make people incredibly unhappy. So there was prescribed techniques of questioning, etc., and a very, very top-down approach in the school. And as Becky just alluded to, and it's not unusual here, very poor behaviour, both inside lessons and on the corridors. So we've only been going since September, but our focus has been about finding out what's going on within the school, then to work on behaviour in the lessons and on the corridors first, and moving on to self-evaluation and middle leadership. And finally now, almost 6 months in, getting into teaching and learning. Had quite a debate with other head teachers about this. And we can argue probably until the cows come home about whether teaching and learning should be first. In my opinion, in a school in a position such as this, we had to sort the behaviour out before we got to the teaching and learning. And I don't believe in this school that if we'd have focused solely on the teaching and learning that the behaviour would have come. It was more about it got out of control and got out of hand, both in lessons and outside of lessons. So the whole idea was to get the staff completely on board and involved. They've not been involved. They've been told what they should do. The staff as a whole was saying leadership need to do this. This is what the leadership team are about. So finding out really was the reason why I approached school surveys, because I needed a platform of survey to get to them, an anonymous way of telling me what they felt about the school and how the school was running and why things weren't necessarily working. And behaviour was overwhelmingly the highest factor. And rather than come up with a behaviour plan and implement it, we spent a considerable time, both just before I started in the summer term and then on our training days, devising and creating our behaviour plan together and putting them centrally in charge of it, including quite a lot of debates about what would happen if a child did this or did that. We gave them a framework and we based it around, and we're going back years now into Cantor's assertive discipline, but using that framework, really passing the book over and to say, look, you're the management as well. We tackle these issues together. Rather than we're SLT tell us what to do, because they've been inherently unsuccessful within the school. In addition to that, I'd be wrong to say we didn't put extra resources into supporting this behaviour. So here's a school survey response. So in June, if you look at the very top bar, this shows us whether they are happy in school. Apologies, I've cut off the color-coded notion, but basically the darker green means I'm really happy at school, and orange means I'm really unhappy at school. So the 17th of June shows you what the staff were feeling about being at Clywedog, and just in October we've managed to shift that bar quite a bit to the right. Why I like the schools survey is this bottom bar, because that tells me what schools like mine typically come back at. So now I'm really proud that we've pushed that green bar beyond a typical school like ourselves. We've got quite a lot of staff motivation at the moment, and that's made a big impact on things within school. I think this is an interesting question that was asked about thinking of your most recent lesson. How much of this lesson did behavioural issues interrupt teaching and learning? So again, in June at the top, and we've managed to shift that bar to the right, but interestingly, we haven't moved it far enough yet to the school like yours bar. So we have, quite significantly shifted it to the right, but more than half of those teachers are describing lessons that were being disrupted in their last lesson. So we're moving. We've not moved far enough, and this bottom bar gives us somewhere to go. And what I like about it is effectively we can get similar to that bottom bar. You feel, well, that's a school like us. I wonder whether we'll ever be entirely green. It gives you an aim that's more realistic to try and head towards. I do want to, though, describe that now the reason we went heavily on behaviour and we made that stick is I think sometimes schools try and change 5 or 10 things all at once. And for me, there's an elastic band effect where if you put your hand in an elastic band and you move it to a place, that's like improving behaviour, and then you let go of it to then improve uniform, and then you let go of it to get rid of mobile phones, and then you let go of it to improve behaviour and homework. And before you know it, you find yourself trying to stretch the elastic band again. What we've got to do is stretch that elastic band and put a pin in it. Make that change and make it stick so that you can then move the next one. And that's very clear that I need time in order to do that. And we're very lucky in Wales that you can have a conversation with the inspectorate to build and buy that time, and with the governing body, etc. So far, we've done our survey. We've worked very heavily on behaviour for learning. We've then moved and talked about marking and assessment. And again, devising a marking and assessment policy with the entire teaching staff, using surveys and then getting them together in meetings to create that, but buying that time to do it properly and make it stick. Then the teaching and learning policy, and now starting our quality assurance of what's taking place within the school. The key for me, though, and I think it comes to what Becky is saying, is that there's a whole element that in some schools we've removed the professionality of teachers. We've basically prescribed what needs to be done in every single lesson, and the whole notion of having a teaching degree and experience in teaching is not necessary. And therefore that leads to a feeling that you're not as valued. So the point I make is, well, here are 5 or 6 different techniques about questioning. You choose which one you want to use Friday afternoon with year 8, because you're the expert. But here's the techniques that you could choose to use. So booklets about teaching and learning techniques and conversations about that techniques, but not being prescriptive, because I can't promise the best children in Wrexham to our local schools. I can't offer any more money. What I can offer is an environment where the teacher's seen as the professional and people therefore want to work here. So we're ideas, we don't prescribe. That does lead, though, to accountability for performance. I do think that if we're telling teachers for the first 20 minutes we need to do this in a lesson, and then for 5 minutes we need to do that, we can't necessarily hold them accountable, because they are saying, well, it's your plan. I wouldn't have done it that way. We need to move ourselves next into the teaching of skills and those teaching of literacy and numeracy right throughout our curriculum, and raising those aspirations. And there's a small group of my lovely year 11s who are doing horticulture. We're very proud of the carrots that they pulled out. So for me, it was about trying to work out how you prove improvement. My examination results will not follow for about 18 months. The current year 11, I don't see bouncing straight up. It's going to take time. It's about involving and designing with staff and flipping the responsibility for teaching and learning back to them with an element of optimism. I think I've stopped sharing, but a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But that's personally the way in which I would have approached it. I know that not necessarily how other people will approach it. And obviously there are flexibilities in Wales that have allowed me to do various things that perhaps one wouldn't do in a multi-academy chain. etc. But I think there are a few philosophical things there that what you said before, Becky, and I hadn't heard what you were going to say before, but ring true to me about a complete change in the professional that we have in front of us compared to what we had previously.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Simon, for sharing those insights. So much for us to think about. I'd love to ask you a question, but I wonder if anyone else who's on the call has got any questions that they'd like to ask Simon or Becky or both. If you'd like to, we haven't gone around and done introductions to everybody, but it'd be lovely to hear from anyone if you'd like to share where you're coming from. If you maybe want to share your own thoughts, or if you have a question for Simon or Becky, that would be super. I'll go ahead and ask my question now, and maybe everyone else who's on the call have a think whether you might like to ask or share. So I was just wondering, Simon, where next in terms of surveying? So it was brilliant to see how you've used the survey platform to involve your staff. And I was wondering, so you did that, you did that back in the summer, and then again you did that last term. Will you be looking to do another survey again at some point during this school year? And would you be repeating the same questions to see how far you've come? Or would you be wanting to look at any other different areas, do you think?
A bit of both, really, June. I will definitely run that same survey, because I think the powerful thing was, if you run the same survey, you get it graphed against your previous responses, which allows you to see where it shifts. And I was just hoping that behaviour would on the elastic band stick, and it would stay out there with that. But I've also got, and I haven't shared it with you, but I've got a parent survey and a pupil survey from June. They're very, very poor. I'm going to survey them in the next couple of months. I wanted to give it a little bit longer. Now, the whole reason I'm doing this is that I knew examination results wouldn't be able to leap up, but I need a way of proving improvement. So if I can get an improved survey from parents and from pupils as well, it'll allow my governing body to feel that they're doing the right thing and giving me the time to improve the school in the long run. So a bit of both. I will run that same survey, but I've also got quite an extensive parent and pupil round of surveys going on. And then there's the things that you always do as a head teacher, and we always change the uniform within the first 24 months. So I've got one about that, and mobile phones and things like that as well. But I think they like being involved, you know, it's just a way of getting more involvement in the community, really.
Fantastic. Thanks, Simon. I can see that we've got some contributions from Ellie in the chat. Thanks, Ellie, for sharing that you're joining us from Manchester. Brilliant. And that you've been doing school surveys as well. So I'm glad to hear you've been finding those useful. Question there, maybe that's a good one for you, Becky. 20% PPA. Oh yes. That's dreamy. I mean, I'd love that. Is it rather like a teacher moving to 0.9 or 0.8% FTE? Yeah,
I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, ask the secondary timetable of what it's like, and it all depends, like how kind they want to be to you. And I think there's quite a serious policy debate going on amongst some of the heads who are experimenting with radical PPA policies about, do teachers really want their PPA bunched so that they've got, you know, a day at home a fortnight, or always having late starts or whatever, or do they actually just want less work and they don't mind it being interspersed throughout the day? You know, at least as far as we can see in the experiments we're running, they do prefer bunching, but not quite as much as you would think. Actually, the number one thing they want is just less work and a smaller teaching load. And that's an incredibly expensive thing to deliver. But yeah, when someone's a part-timer, you know, then in theory, you need to be giving them dedicated time off that's bunched together, such as a day off a week. And that's much harder for a school to deliver, isn't it?
Yeah, but I would not like to be in charge of a timetable for a school like that. Simon, have you got a question or a thought on that?
Yeah, just a thought on what Becky was saying. I think you're absolutely right, and it's interesting here to hear from Ellie there. I think for me, the whole thing of what we expected a teacher to do before the pandemic was taken for granted. I expected everybody to walk past my office with a massive box of books that they stuck in their car, and they marked them all every night till midnight, and then they came into school the next day and run through. And it was just one of those things that happened, and nobody questioned it at all. And now everybody's seriously questioning whether that's how they want to spend their evenings, and that's how they want to spend their lives, whether it's planning, marking. We've got to be able to somehow think about how we adapt to our modern workforce. It's almost like a complete shift. I mean, I've never had an interview experience as I had this year, when I sat down with a group of candidates and offered one of them the job for, you know, and you know, for years people, oh, thank you very much, I'm really excited to have this job. But this time the candidate said, oh, well, I'll think about it, I'll let you know in a week. And the boot is definitely on the other foot. And I think as leaders, we really need to think about what that means, and how we make it work with our workforce. Because as the best teachers become scarce, keeping them in your own institution, as you described, it costs about $9 grand, costs us quite a bit.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, isn't it? We've got a question from Julian there. Can I give us a brief flavour of the student questionnaires? Yes. So on our platform, you can set up the different types of surveys, and I won't share one right now, but it's something, Julian, I could send you an example of afterwards. But I don't know, Simon, if you've asked particular questions. So you can survey your pupils, and then you'll get breakdown by year group. So you can ask them questions about their experience of school, whether they've been bullied, their learning, their homework, their attitudes. So have you done some of that yet, Simon? Were you saying you're about to start doing?
Yeah, no, I have. And what's interesting is there's a whole bunch of questions already written, and those pre-written questions have got those national answers. So that's really used to compare, but you can throw your own ones in too. But clearly then you're not going to get a national answer comparison with those individual ones. So I'm dotting my own ones in amongst the set ones. And I never thought of this, but they all start with a positive question about, tell us something that's happened that's positive in your day, or positive in your job. And it actually sets the right tone, because, you know, otherwise your parents are coming in, or your pupils are coming in on the basis of just what they've had yesterday, or the day before, and they're not thinking a bit more broadly. But I would tend to go with there's kind of like categorizations, and I go with a category of those questions, but then throw my own ones in, dot them throughout to make sure that I'm getting exactly what I want out of the survey.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I mean, sometimes I think the challenge can be deciding what to ask, because we've got a bank of 300 questions on our platform, and we've categorized them all to try and make it straightforward to think, am I focusing on behaviour questions, or am I focusing on wellbeing, workload? And then choosing, because you don't want to overwhelm, you don't want to ask too many questions all in one go. We're all about making it easy, simple, quick, because you're wanting to get that responsiveness. And I think I love, Simon, the way you're talking about this sort of philosophy of involving your teachers and saying you want to really respect them as professionals. That feels quite empowering for them, I suppose. And maybe if you uncover an issue, then you can say, right, who's going to work on this with me? You know, we want to change something about how we're doing our marking. Let's have maybe a follow-up group, a focus group, a working party to really actually get people solving some of these very tricky problems. So that sounds like a really great approach.
That's right, because what I've noticed is that when schools are taken over, when they're in a real mess, that actually the thing that you think about first is to just make everything the same, and reduce that professionalism. But I think in the long run, it's counterproductive. I think if we're going to make sustainable long-term change, it's about improving that professionalism of teachers. And I don't know, Becky, if any of your research investigates professionalism, but that is what I think is behind a number of the discontent with school. Real moves in some schools to be very prescriptive about, this is what you're doing for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and you almost feel that anybody without a teaching degree and without an experience would be able to pick up those lessons and deliver. So where's the art of being a teacher? Where's that adaptability to make it work for you on a Friday afternoon if it's windy and rainy outside, etc.?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a wealth of evidence showing that people value and want to feel they have autonomy over their professional lives. But then, the other nice language to use around that is also about when do we need kind of collegiality and common approaches. And behaviour is just a really good example of that in secondary schools, helping even very experienced teachers understand why everybody has to work out how we're going to do exactly the same thing. And when it comes to adhering to behaviour policies is really important, because in secondary schools in particular, you share the children, you share the students. So you have to have these shared approaches, but you don't have to have shared approaches around other elements of the classroom. And indeed, it tends to be kind of really destructive for particular subjects, because just the nature of knowledge within subjects and what it means to learn is all completely and utterly different. So when you get everybody and tell them they all must be doing multiple choice quizzes, like, understandably, it kind of upsets the drama department and so on. But that's what you see happening in the name of kind of, these common approaches.
Interesting. It's very challenging. I mean, our whole mission really is about making teachers' voices heard. So whether that's Teacher Tapp, just wanting to hear what they think, what their experiences are, all those, that's what we're about. And so if you're able to do that in your school with the surveys, that, we think that's really exciting and hopefully very empowering. We're nearly at time. Does anyone else got a question that they were hoping to ask, or a comment? Any other final thoughts or questions from anyone? Well, it might just remain for me to say then in our last minute that it's been wonderful to have you here, and I'll just share as a final thing that at the moment we are inviting schools to try out our survey questions, our job satisfaction questions. So if you haven't already, you might like to click on this QR code, or come to our website, and then you can have a go at doing your own survey of your staff and see how you get on with that. I think that's the last thing. So thank you very much to our speakers, to Becky and Simon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for everyone else for joining us. And I think we will leave it there.